Welcome back. The African Capacity Building Foundation is the African Union's specialized agency for capacity development. The foundation advise and support African countries, regional economic communities and institutions on decisive steps to take to develop and the practical skills urgently required for the continent's economic transformation. Economist and development expert Professor Emmanuel Nnadozie is the executive secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation, and he joins us now via Zoom. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Thank you for joining us here on SABC News.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, the ACBF produces and coordinates on a biannual basis the Africa Capacity Report. Talk to us about this most recent report and ACBF's vision for capacity development on the continent and the plans for national development, which could effectively support member states to realize the Agenda 2063.
Yes, we produce our flagship publication, the Africa Capacity Report, which basically tries to look at the state of capacity in all African countries and to determine specifically what can be done to build capacity for human capacity to retain and fully utilize that capacity. And the good news from our index that we measure periodically on African capacity indices shows that there's some improvement. At least the majority of the countries are no longer at the low capacity level, the medium capacity level. But each of the reports will always focus on a theme, and the most recent one was on leadership, because we believe strongly that leadership capacity is a major issue in many African countries. And when we talk about leadership, we're not just simply talking about the president or the head of state, but we are also talking about leadership at various levels of government and non-state actors as well. And so our assessment was that because of lack of visionary and strong and productive leadership, it's difficult for many countries to really implement their development strategies. Everybody has strategies, but the implementation capacity is weak, and therefore getting the results from development is something that is a problem for African countries. And we did make strong recommendations about how to really build leadership capacity, giving examples of places where you have such kinds of visionary and committed leadership that is accountable to the people.
You talk about accountability, and it's very interesting because we seem to be having quite an issue here in South Africa. You've mentioned the fact that this is not just about leadership politically in terms of heads of states and so forth, but certainly that is very important, especially when we're looking at the African landscape. And if we were to zoom in on even in South Africa, where we are having some issues. I mean, we're dealing currently with the issue of corruption. What are some of the recommendations politically, though, that you can kind of give in terms of political leadership? Because that is quite a sticking point. I mean, even if we're looking at business leadership, we still have to, no doubt, look at political leadership too. Are those some issues that the African continent really can sort of look more into in terms of developing their own leadership? And I am going to actually talk about political leadership in particular. As I say, there is quite what I would kind of call a bit of a crisis, isn't it?
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct in the way you have articulated the problem. Often, many African countries mistakenly think that the idea is to focus on the economic development just directly. They forget that good politics is good economics, and that begins with the political parties and then the other stakeholders who are also those who play a key role in ensuring this accountability that you mentioned, whether they are civil society organizations or they are individuals and non-state actors, including the media, by the way. So many found often is that when you have elections and democracies, the idea is that a political party comes to power, but often they are not very well equipped. They don't have the capacity to articulate and implement the kinds of policies that will improve the lives of people. But far more importantly is that the balance between the executive and the legislature and the judiciary is not well maintained. Because these are where the checks and balances have to come into play, so that those who are, corrupt or that are not, performing in the interest of the people could be held accountable. But it is work in progress. We've seen that this is not something that is absolute, that even in developed countries, they have to continuously to strengthen the accountability mechanisms in place. Like I said before, whether it is the non-state actors or the three branches of government that is supposed to be functioning properly. So for us in ACBF, what we have been doing is, in addition to supporting good political and economic development policies, we are also strengthening the capacity of these other institutions I mentioned, whether it's the judiciary, the Auditor General's office, the parliaments, and the civil society organizations, so that they can play their role along with the media to ensure that accountability is something that is enforced.
Prof, you were this week a panelist at the virtual dialogue organized by the African Tax Administration Forum. You discussed the impact of the ambitious African Continental Free Trade Area on trade and tax revenue on African states. What can you tell us was of particular significance in this dialogue? And do African states have the capability and I suppose then capacity when it comes to this ambitious African Continental Free Trade Area on trade?
Yes, as you know, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which has now been ratified because they got the minimum number that is required to ratify it, was supposed to come into effect July 1 this year. But because of COVID-19 pandemic, this has been postponed to January next year, 2021. But notwithstanding this delay, there is a widespread agreement and understanding that this is a game changer for the continent, and that it will be something that could help African countries to generate, revenues that could enable them to provide goods and services for the people and to bring about social development. And so, in light of that, I was in a panel in which we were to discuss the impact of the AFCFTA on tax revenues and the kind of tax policy measures that will be required by African countries to benefit from its implementation. And it is sort of things that has to happen. As you know, this agreement is the COVID-19 pandemic and the post-COVID-19 period will be a period when African countries will have to come to terms with the severity of the impact that has had with them. Practically everybody has overborrowed now, so debt crisis is looming. Revenues would have to be generated mostly from a domestic resource mobilization standpoint to be able to fulfill these kinds of needs. So I made some recommendations about the sort of things that can be done to increase or to improve the domestic resource mobilization in many African countries.
All right. Prof, would you appreciate your time? I wish we had more time to discuss some of those recommendations, but certainly we'll catch up with you at another point. Thank you, Professor Emmanuel Nnadozie, who is, of course, the Executive Secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation. Thank you, sir. All right, let's take a short break.